Next, former Vice President Dick Cheney and former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta discuss national security, bipartisanship, and civil discourse in politics. The University of Pittsburgh's John Murtha Center for Public Service hosted the hour-long event.
Good evening and welcome. We're here this evening as part of a Murtha Center event. And for those of you who have not heard about Congressman John Murtha and the Murtha Foundation, Congressman Murtha was someone who exemplified sacrifice, civic duty, and courage, things that are very important in this day of remembrance. And for the students here, what day is this in terms of history? Right? What's that? Yes? Veterans Day, and what do we celebrate on Veterans Day? Okay. Well, so on this day, we are reminded of the courage of veterans, and Congressman Murtha himself was a veteran, and he was one who said every man, every woman, everyone can make a difference. So if you go to the Murtha Center, you would see that sentence, one person, one man can make a difference. And as I like to say, one student, you too can say one student can make a difference. So at the university from time to time, and today under the auspices of the Murtha Foundation, we invite guests to the university who can provide insights on current events, who can share their experience, and who can tell us something that would illuminate an issue that is important to our country and our community. I hope that as part of this event, you too will come away having learned something through a process of open discussion and perhaps in the question and answer session that is going to be moderated by Dr. Rabley. It is my pleasure then to introduce to you this evening Mr. Ed Sheehan, President and Chief Executive Officer of Concurrent Technologies Corporation and the Chairman of the John P. Murtha Foundation.
Good evening and welcome everyone on behalf of Joyce Murtha and the John P. Murtha Foundation Board. As Dr. Spector mentioned, I have the privilege of not only serving as President and CEO at Concurrent Technologies Corporation here in Johnstown, but also serving as Vice Chair of the John P. Murtha Foundation. Obviously, we want to make sure that we acknowledge Veterans Day. Today is Veterans Day observed. November 10th was the anniversary of the start of the U.S. Marine Corps. And Sunday, we celebrated Veterans Day and the 100th anniversary of the World War I armistice. To bring something like this together takes a lot of work. And so I want to thank all of those who helped make this possible this evening, especially the staff at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown and the Community Foundation for the Alleghenies. Let's give them a round of applause. This kind of event is a good thing for our region and takes advantage of this wonderful university and the John P. Murtha Center for encouraging civil public discourse and learning for students of all ages. Now, this evening we have the benefit of having two renowned speakers, of whom I will introduce shortly. I first saw them together 2 years ago in California at the Ronald Reagan Library while I attended a forum, the Defense Forum, and they spoke. They were on the stage together, set up much like this is, and they talked about the important issues at that time, and they talked about the need for bipartisan leadership. And the first person that they both spoke of was Congressman Jack Murtha, our congressman, who was able to bridge over party differences and over the House and the Senate and the President and get things done. And so I thought that was very special. And so in my role as Vice Chairman of the Murtha Foundation, I thought, wouldn't it be phenomenal to have those two gentlemen here in Johnstown to help kick off the inaugural speaker series sponsored by the John P. Murtha Foundation. And so here they are. And so I want to acknowledge and thank my fellow board member on the Murtha Foundation board, Susan O'Neill, Tip O'Neill's daughter, who maintains great relationships with a number of different leaders throughout our nation. And she was able to reach out to these two gentlemen and work with their staffs to make this evening a reality. So I'd like to take a moment and thank Susan O'Neill. Let's please recognize Susan. And now let me introduce our moderator for this evening. Many of you in this room know him. Dr. Ray Rabley is a professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, the chair of the Division of Social Sciences and the chair of the Division of Business and Enterprise. He also serves as the faculty liaison for the John P. Murtha Center. Dr. Rabley teaches courses in American politics, political ideologies, presidency, Congress, electoral behavior, and environmental policy. His recent research and publications focus on public lands policy in Western states. He earned his PhD from Arizona State University and his master's and bachelor's degrees from Virginia Tech. Prior to coming to Pitt Johnstown, Dr. Rabley taught at Casper College in Wyoming and Arizona State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray Rabley. I now have the privilege of introducing Vice President Dick Cheney. Across 4 decades of public life, Vice President Dick Cheney has served at the highest levels of government during some of the most critical days in modern American history. Vice President Cheney's political career began in 1969 when he was an intern for Congressman William Steiger. He then joined the staff of Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. His subsequent positions in the White House included White House Staff Assistant, Assistant Director of the Cost of Living Council, Deputy Assistant to the President, and White House Chief of Staff. In the post-Watergate administration of Gerald Ford, the President turned to 34-year-old Dick Cheney to lead the White House staff in the work of restoring the nation's confidence and waging the President's 1976 campaign. After leaving the White House, Vice President Cheney returned to his home state of Wyoming, where he served in the House of Representatives. Re-elected to office 5 times, Mr. Cheney held several leadership positions and was chosen by his colleagues as the House Minority Whip, the number 2 position in the House Republican leadership. He was elected and served as the chairman of the Republican Policy Committee from 1981 to 1987. In 1989, President George Herbert Walker Bush nominated Cheney to become the U.S. Secretary of Defense. After unanimous approval in the Senate, then Secretary Cheney led American forces to victory in Operation Just Cause in Panama and Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf. In 1991, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In that same year, he received the U.S. Senator John Heinz Award for Greatest Public Service by an elected or appointed official. Through most of the 1990s, Vice President Cheney worked in the private sector as Chief Executive Officer of the Halliburton Company in Dallas, Texas. Then, from 2001 to 2009, he served 2 terms as Vice President of the United States, along with President George W. Bush. He was best known for his involvement in national security matters following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, playing an important role in the administration's response to the attacks and the coordination of the global war on terrorism. Today, he and his wife, Lynn, live in Wyoming. They have 2 daughters and 7 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Vice President Dick Cheney. I'm also very honored and privileged to introduce Secretary Leon Panetta. A Monterey native and Santa Clara University School of Law graduate, Secretary Panetta began his long and distinguished public service career in 1964 as a first lieutenant in the United States Army, and upon discharge went to work in Washington as a legislative assistant to United States Senate Majority Whip Tom Kuchel of California. In 1969, he was appointed director of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare's Office for Civil Rights, where he was responsible for enforcing equal education laws. Later, he served as executive assistant to the mayor of New York City. He then returned to Monterey, where he practiced law until his election to the House of Representatives, United States House of Representatives, in 1976. Serving in Congress for 16 years, Secretary Panetta was a key participant in agricultural, healthcare, ocean, and federal budget issues. From 1989 to 1993, he chaired the House Budget Committee. He authored a wide range of legislation, including the Hunger Prevention Act of 1988, Medicaid and Medicare coverage for hospice care for the terminally ill, and numerous measures to protect the California coast, including creation of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. In 1993, Secretary Panetta left Congress to serve as director of the Office of Management and Budget for President Clinton. There, he was instrumental in developing the policies that led to a balanced federal budget and eventual surpluses. In 1994, he accepted appointment as the President's Chief of Staff and immediately brought order and focus to White House operations. Upon leaving the Clinton administration in 1997, Secretary Panetta joined with his wife Sylvia to establish and co-direct the Panetta Institute for Public Policy based at California State University, Monterey Bay. Reflecting Secretary Panetta's own ideals and personal example, the nonpartisan, not-for-profit study center seeks to attract thoughtful men and women to lives of public service and prepare them for policy challenges of the future. Returning to public service in the Obama administration as director of the CIA, he ran the operation that brought Osama bin Laden to justice, and as Secretary of Defense, led the effort to develop a new defense strategy, helped bring two wars to an end, and opened up opportunities for everyone to serve in the military. Secretary Panetta returned to the Panetta Institute as chairman on February 27, 2013, and resumed his role as moderator of the renowned Leon Panetta Lecture Series. He chronicles his life in public service in his best-selling memoir, Worthy Fights, which was published in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Leon Panetta. Dr. Rabley, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Ed. I'll do a quick tech check here. Secretary Panetta, we can see you. Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Hopefully you can hear me.
Okay, we can hear you. Vice President Cheney, you want to say hello?
Good evening, Leon.
Good evening, Dick.
We're getting good at this.
We do this either on stage together or we can do it across different places in the country.
Right.
We had expected and hoped to have Secretary Panetta with us in another chair here on the stage. Some travel logistical glitches stranded him in California, so he's in his office there in Monterey. I want to join Ed Sheehan in thanking the staff here at Pitt Johnstown and the Community Foundation, who worked all day long to make sure that we had this hookup so that Secretary Panetta could join us this evening. I also want to thank the Murtha Foundation and applaud their commitment to sharing the legacy of Jack Murtha and really of spreading the values of democratic citizenship, of engagement and leadership and making a difference. Congressman Jack Murtha was a regular in my classes, and I'm used to standing in class at a board and writing when I talk in this kind of casual living room setting is a little bit unusual for me, so I have to get used to that. But Congressman Murtha was committed to instilling in young people a commitment to public service, and we were always glad to have him in class. It's fitting then that we welcome tonight two men who have served for decades in so many important public roles and sat at the table for momentous historical decisions in the late 20th and 21st centuries. I date myself, but I remember the TV documentaries called And You Are There, which gave insight into historical events like the death of Socrates or the murder of Jesse James. And I'm not suggesting that either of our guests tonight were present at or responsible for either of those events. Don't believe what you read on the internet. But we will get an opportunity to be there to some extent, to look back a bit and to look forward across our current national and global political landscapes, and to hear from two men whose perspectives and experience we value. Now, as they were just implying, Secretary Panetta and Vice President Cheney did a matinee version of this event a little while ago in a more intimate setting with many people who had connections to Congressman Murtha and with many, let's call them seasoned citizens whose political memory stretched back many more decades. And so I'm going to ask both of them to indulge me a bit tonight, because we'll be covering some of the same ground with a broader audience, many of them college students. I've taught here since 1987, and I know that many students in my political science classes say routinely that they're not necessarily into politics, and they're often turned off to politics. And so we're glad to have so many of them out. I'm going to lead off with some questions for both the Secretary and the Vice President, and you all should have gotten cards distributed to you and something to write on when you came in. Is that right? You do? So one of the things that we'll invite you to do is to jot down questions that you might have, because we want to integrate questions from the audience. And when you're done writing down a question, if you just want to wave it and get the attention of one of our student volunteers here, they'll make sure that those get handed up. And so we'll do a combination of lead-off questions from me, and then hopefully be able to answer some questions that the audience has. I'd like to begin by pointing out that Vice President Cheney and Secretary Panetta served together in the United States House of Representatives. Vice President Cheney is a Republican from Wyoming, Secretary Panetta is a Democrat from California. Johnstown's Jack Murtha was their colleague in the House of Representatives. Last Tuesday, Vice President Cheney's daughter, Liz Cheney, was reelected to the House of Representatives as a Republican from Wyoming, and Secretary Panetta's son, Jimmy Panetta, was reelected as a Democrat from California. And that leads me to two quick questions up front. It's obvious that both you and your families have a commitment to public service, and Mrs. Cheney has a distinguished service career as well as public servant. And so my first question is, why would you recommend public service to the young people who are here tonight, especially given the increasingly intense scrutiny and even vitriol to which public servants are subjected? Vice President Cheney.
Well, sometimes you'll hear discussions by political families about how hard it is to work, to run for office, to put up with criticism and so forth. And it's been just the opposite in my family. I have two daughters. One is now in Congress, the other has a political consulting firm. And my wife, they're three very strong women. When we get together, we usually end up telling war stories about old campaigns. As we started out, I was fairly young when I started the first time, but the kids were really little. But they remember all of that, and I think they consider themselves blessed to have been able to sort of watch up closely how our process, our system works. They have both chosen careers. In one case, Liz, our oldest, is an office holder, is a candidate, but daughter Mary has an intriguing business she runs. She runs campaigns without candidates. She says candidates just mess up campaigns. So she gets involved in campaigns about referenda that are on the ballot and so forth. But in our case, we've loved it, been part of it, of our family now for more than 50 years. And I strongly recommend it. Tremendous opportunities, interest, all kinds of ways to be involved. And I was even going to be a political science professor at one point.
I read that. Secretary Panetta.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I apologize I couldn't be there in person, but it's great to have the opportunity to be there and to pay tribute to our great friend, John Murtha, and also to all of his family. So thank you very much for this opportunity. as many know, I'm the son of Italian immigrants. My parents came here, like millions of others, in the early 30s. Very few skills, very little language ability, very little money. But they believe deeply in the opportunity here. I used to ask my father, why would you leave your friends and your family, although they came from a poor area in Italy, why would you leave them to travel all that distance to come to a new country, a new land? And I never forgot my father's response. He said, your mother and I believed we could give our children a better life in this country. And I think that's the American dream. That's what we all want for our children, and hopefully the dream that they'll want for their children as well. But that dream is not achieved simply by saying it. It's achieved through sacrifice, through service, through dedication, to make sure that we do give our children a better life in this country. And I was urged to get involved in public life by my parents, who felt that this country gave them the opportunity to succeed and that their children owed something back to the country. I also, as you mentioned, served in the Army and got a real chance to see people from across the country coming together to work on a common mission. They understood what duty to country was all about. And there was a young president at the time who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That inspired me to get involved in public life. And I would say to young people that it's important for you to understand that you have a duty to this country as well. Our forefathers created a remarkable democracy with a remarkable constitution. They didn't believe that power ought to be centralized in any one branch of government. They didn't want a king, they didn't want a king parliament, they didn't want a star chamber court. So they created this remarkable system of checks and balances. But the greatest power is placed in the people. The Constitution begins with the words, we the people, in order to create a more perfect union. And it means that people have the ultimate power in our democracy to determine the future of what America looks like. And so for young people, I would just say, do not assume that, that everything that may not look right in government today, that somehow it has to be that way. You can really make a difference. I always felt I could make a difference in the jobs I held in government. And the whole purpose of life is to make a difference in other people's lives. So I would just urge all young people to understand that they have a responsibility to give back to this country. The men and women in uniform understand that, and they do it every day. But it's important for other men and women to understand that they too have a duty to this government and to our democracy. That's what our democracy is all about, and that's how our democracy can survive in the future.
And you both mentioned sacrifice and duty and giving back and giving something. I just wonder whether there's also some getting something. What is the reward? You've spent decades, both of you. What is the reward that you get yourselves for being a public servant?
Well, I was heavily influenced. Just mentioned, I started out to be a political science professor. I was in Washington studying the Congress on a grant, and then I was going to go back to the University of Wisconsin and get my PhD. While I was there, I worked for some tremendous individuals, a guy named Bill Steiger from Wisconsin, or Don Rumsfeld from Illinois, and most especially Jerry Ford. The day Jerry Ford was sworn in as president, I went back to the White House to work on the transition. But I finished that period of time, really sort of the Nixon-Ford years, having to make a decision about what do you want to do? What are you going to do next? And as I thought about it, I could go make money, or I could stay and be a lobbyist, or, lots of other options. But what I really wanted to do was put my own name on the ballot. that if I was going to be involved in the public arena, public service, I didn't want to just be working for somebody who put their name on the ballot. I didn't like it when I lost a job because somebody else lost an election. So I really wanted to do it myself, and went home to Wyoming and announced for it and did it. Served 10 years, but once I was started, 10 years in the House, 4 years at Defense, 8 years as Vice President. I was a junkie. I loved it.
Secretary Panetta.
Well, it gets down to the ability to really change other people's lives for the better. That's a great reward in public service. I'm often asked, because of all the jobs I've held, like Dick has, what was your favorite job? And people are kind of surprised by my answer because, I served in the House for 16 years, and I've often said that in my 50 years of public life, I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The good news is I saw Washington work, and I saw Republicans and Democrats willing to work together in order to get legislative action accomplished, in order to resolve problems in this country. And I truly enjoyed being a member of Congress because I had the opportunity to help people in my district get things accomplished for people here, but more importantly, work on issues that impacted on people in this country. As chairman of the Budget Committee, we were working at a time when there were deficits as well. There were smaller deficits than what we have now. But that effort to deal with deficits was a bipartisan effort. Republicans and Democrats, a Republican president, President Bush, had us come together, Republicans and Democrats, to try to develop a significant deficit reduction plan to try to reduce the deficit. And when I was OMB director with Bill Clinton, we were able to pass a similar budget. And the combination of those budgets helped a great deal to ultimately produce a balanced budget and a surplus. That was a great accomplishment and an important one for the country. But whether it was that, or whether it was serving people in my district, whether it was working in the CIA and providing intelligence and doing the Osama bin Laden operation, whether it was as Secretary of Defense working with those great men and women in uniform, the whole purpose is to make this a better country and to do things that give people a chance at a better life. And there is no greater reward in public service. You don't make a lot of money in public service, but if you can help others have a better life, that's probably the best reward you can ever receive.
Thank you. The political environment in which you both worked in the House of Representatives with Jack Murtha was different than the environment in which Representatives Cheney and Panetta work today. How is it different, and to what do you attribute those differences?
Well, it has changed dramatically. Leon and I are here today primarily because of our friendship and with Jack Murtha. As I mentioned previously, when I became Secretary of Defense, Jack was chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee in the House. That meant that he was just about the most important member of Congress from my perspective, and the job I had to do of budgeting for defense and providing for us to have the necessary ability to defend the nation. But that was a major accomplishment, major responsibility for Jack. I came away tremendously impressed with all that he enabled us to do, and the effort was, as Leon said, extraordinarily rewarding. You'd be able to look back on that now with some satisfaction, but most of all, the time I spent, I had probably the most important assignment was service as Secretary of Defense. That more than anything else I did.
Secretary Panetta, the environment today is part of the...
I said this earlier, and I'll repeat it. As I said, I've seen Washington work. The reason it worked is because of trust. Because despite political differences that we all had, despite different views, despite different approaches to issues, there was a fundamental trust that was present in which you could sit down and work together, be able to be honest with each other, tell people what your views were, and ultimately try to find consensus, try to get something done. That's what legislating is all about. That's what governing is all about. The ability of the president, leadership, and the Congress to be willing to work together, regardless of party, in order to get things done for the country. The problem today is that there is little trust between the parties. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's much more partisan than it ever was. There is little trust in trying to work with one another. Money plays a big role in politics today. Districts have been carved out that are safe Republican and safe Democratic seats. What happens is they're worried about people running to their left or to their right, and that forces more members to the extremes than to the center, where you can literally get things done. And then the media, frankly, has contributed to that divisiveness as well. We have, media and social media today. All of the social media takes positions on issues. It's very difficult to figure out what the truth is all about. And all of that feeds into this very, very difficult gridlock that we have in Washington, in which major issues that face the country are not being dealt with because the parties cannot sit down in an honest way and try to resolve these issues. The simplest example, something that you have to keep asking yourself, why the hell hasn't this been done, is infrastructure funding for infrastructure. There's no member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, who opposes providing more funds for infrastructure in this country. And yet, for the last 2 years, even though the president talked about it, nothing's been done. Nothing's been done. We've got, talking about a balanced budget, today we've got a $20 trillion national debt. We're looking at a $1 trillion deficit. As Dick mentioned, we're probably going to pay more in interest payments than we pay in the defense budget. And that's going to undermine our economy for the future. And yet, as much as everybody talks about that problem, neither Republicans or Democrats want to make the hard decisions in order to solve it. I think it has gotten to the point where it really does undermine the strength of our democracy not to have both parties and to have the president willing to sit down and solve the issues facing this country. The United States cannot be a strong country in the future if we are not dealing with the problems we have here at home. If all we're doing is playing political war, political gamesmanship, and blaming each other, if that's all we're going to do, we are going to hurt our democracy for the future.
You've both mentioned the need for leaders to make tough decisions. You both have been involved in some of that tough decision making. Earlier today, we continue to pit Johnstown Veterans Day tradition of holding a ceremony at the Heroes Memorial on our campus, where the names of over 4,000 service members who gave their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq are inscribed on granite slabs. The U.S. government estimates that over 30,000 service members were wounded in Iraq. Some of them are probably in this audience. Some of them have been our students. And well more than 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. Vice President Cheney, you are at the center of the decision-making that led to the Iraq War. Secretary Panetta, you served as Secretary of Defense and CIA Director in an administration that spent 8 years grappling with that war in Iraq. You've both written and spoken extensively about the decisions that were made in the Bush and the Obama administrations, so I don't think we need to rehash those decisions, but I think it would be interesting to hear when you're sitting making life and death decisions, what type of calculations went into those types of decisions, whether it's to initiate the war or the subsequent conduct in the war, or to target drone strikes on U.S. citizens, as in Secretary Panetta's case. So I'd be curious about that.
Well, that's sort of the $64 question when you take one of those jobs. And lots of times it's valuable to look back at history to see if there are lessons to be learned there. I think it's important for people who hold those senior positions take the time if they're going to take on that responsibility, that there's a lot to be learned from our own history. It's also important when you begin to put that together. One of the things that happens when new administrations come in, and both the Secretary of Defense as well as the President's involved in this, but there's a thing called the SIOP. It's the Single Integrated Operating Plan. It's the basic plan and capability that would allow the President to order a nuclear strike to be able to respond to an attack upon the United States. It's pretty scary stuff. And presidents are briefed on that before they're sworn in and look at it, and usually it'll rattle the rafters in terms of thinking about, you've got 15 minutes to respond, what do you do? Now, fortunately, no one's had to use that since Harry Truman, but the thing I was always, if I were to try to improve on the process to get people ready for those kinds of decisions, I think we could do a much better job than we do of going back historically and looking at the conventional use of forces over that period of time. I know when I went to defense, I had them prepare a brief for me that focused on everything since Vietnam, anytime the use of force had been ordered up. Going through the process happened to us in the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. We were faced with a situation in Panama where there was a dictator. There were American military personnel at risk. We ultimately decided to act, but supposedly it was going to be a coup against Noriega. By the time we could get a decision made among our principals, this was early in our administration, it was already over with. The people who had plotted against Noriega had been overthrown, shot, and we just blew it in effect. It wasn't a big time, but it was the first time we had a chance. Out of that came some careful decisions we made in terms of how we were going to deal with these issues and these crises type situations, specifically with the use of military force. Now, it's never perfect. It's never, you never have all the facts you'd like to have. And in case of Iraq, of course, our first experience was in Desert Storm when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. And we went in with our U.S. forces and did, I think, a commendable job in driving him out of Kuwait and restoring order to the government in Iraq. Later on, when we went back in 2003, the issue turned more than anything else on the question of weapons of mass destruction. From the time that we were sworn in, shortly before we were sworn in, we first began to get the daily brief the president always gets. We were receiving the very first brief, I still remember, warned about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. For the next 17 months, we got a constant drumfire of that kind of reporting from the intelligence community. In the fall of '02, there was a thing called a national intelligence estimate prepared by the community at the direction of the CIA. It's about as heavy a report as you're going to get in terms of really serious consequences. Again, warned about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. On the weekend, while we're in the planning process, We had a Saturday meeting in the Oval Office of the President, myself, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, I believe, was there, and George Tenet, who was the CIA director, and his deputy. And after they'd briefed on this whole group of intelligence reports that supposedly laid it all out for us, President Bush asked, he said, gentlemen, he said, George in particular, he said, how good is the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And the answer he got was, it's a slam dunk, Mr. President. It's a slam dunk. That's the set of circumstances he was faced with when we had to make that final decision. It wasn't the kind of thing we felt we could walk away from. And so we made the decision to go forward to take down Saddam Hussein, which is what we did. We achieved our objective. It obviously was a tough, complicated proposition. I still, to this day, think we did the right thing. Would recommend that same course of action again, although it is without question was a controversial operation.
Secretary Panetta.
You know, the bottom line on all of this is that leadership, whether it's in Congress or at the White House, a strong leadership requires that oftentimes you have to take risks. If you're not willing to take risks, you're not going to be much of a leader. And add to that the fact that the principal responsibility of the President of the United States, principal responsibility of the President of the United States is to protect this country and protect the security of this country. I felt when I was director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, my primary role was to defend this country and protect the security of the United States. And so when something like 9/11 happens and we're attacked, this country goes to war because we've been brutally attacked, and over 3,000 people died as a result of that attack. And so the principal thrust then was to go after the person who was responsible for that attack on the United States, Osama bin Laden. You know, the first effort was to try to go after him in Afghanistan, and you know, I think the closest we came to him was at Tora Bora, and after that, there was absolutely no idea where he was. But we knew that the leadership of Al-Qaeda was in Pakistan, and the problem was the Pakistanis were not going to let us use B-2 bombers or F-16s or boots on the ground to go after that leadership. And so the decision was made that we still had a responsibility to protect this country. And there were those in Al-Qaeda who were still planning additional attacks in this country. So the idea of using drones to be able to go after those leaders was developed actually when Dick Cheney was vice president, and President Bush made the decision to do that. And President Obama continued those operations. Why? Because it was the most effective way to go after the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And that's what we did. And the President Obama felt that the principal threat to our country coming out of 9/11 remained terrorism, remained Al-Qaeda and its offshoots. That was the principal concern, that innocent Americans in this country could be killed by terrorists. And so in the CIA, the Pentagon, Special Forces, we were all committed to the effort to try to make sure that that never happened. And I have to say, a lot of progress was made in improving intelligence sharing. We went after the terrorists in Iraq. We had terrorism in Iraq that we had to go after. We had terrorism in Afghanistan that we had to go after. We had terrorism in Pakistan that we had to go after. But the whole point is that the decision by the presidents was a decision to protect our country. And by the way, when we decided to conduct the raid to go after bin Laden, that was a very risky operation. We found this compound, we followed the intelligence to this compound, but we never had 100% intelligence that Osama bin Laden was there. We had good indications. It was his couriers who owned the compound, but it was still very risky. It was in the middle of Pakistan. It took a risky decision to conduct that operation. But that's what presidents have to do. They've got to be willing to take risks in order to protect this country. And that, frankly, is what national security is all about.
Thank you. 15 years later, we have troops still in Iraq and casualties still in Iraq. But looking across at threats that presidents need to be aware of, I'll ask you to review a couple of those, including whether what's happening in Iraq, Iran's presence in Iraq, is one of those significant threats. But former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, spoke about Putin's playbook, as he called it, to weaken NATO, to weaken the European Union, and to undermine trust in democratic institutions, including in the United States, using many tools, but especially through information and cyber warfare or psychological warfare. How do you assess Putin's aspirations and worldview and his ability to effectively pursue them?
Well, I think he's deadly serious about his aspirations. I always hark back to the decision or the announcement he made, I guess an opinion he expressed, that the collapse of the old Soviet Empire was one of the worst events to befall mankind in human history. He didn't like it when the Soviet Union went out of business at the end of '91. He's clearly demonstrated an interest in trying to recapture, or at least to reassert control over some of the states that are no longer part of the old Soviet Empire. I think the work he's done with respect to using the modern technology to try to interfere with our elections is a really threatening piece of business, that we should not tolerate it, that we ought to find ways to respond. I am reluctant to specify exactly what could be done, I guess. A lot of it you can't talk about. But the fact of the matter is we ought to be able to take action against him, to recognize that he represents a major national security threat when he begins the process of trying to control or influence our elections.
Secretary Panetta?
Look, we're in a new chapter of the Cold War. It's tough to come to that recognition, but that's the reality. We are in a new chapter of the Cold War. We fought the Soviet Union. The result of that was to bring down the Berlin Wall. We thought there would be a period where we would be able to develop a better relationship with Russia. We made an effort at that. President Bush made an effort at that. President Obama made an effort at that. And the problem is that Putin, if he senses weakness, he will take advantage of it. He's a bully. What he has sensed is weakness, and it's over the last number of years, both Republican and Democratic presidents. And the result was, in sensing that weakness, it emboldened him. So he suddenly goes into the Crimea, he goes into the Ukraine, he deploys forces to Syria in the Middle East, and he conducts this cyber operation against the United States and our election process. Why? Because he felt he could get away with it. And it just tells us that if we're serious about dealing with Putin, I've had the opportunity to meet Putin, as I'm sure Dick has and others. He's a tough guy. But what you have to do is make very clear to them that there are lines that cannot be crossed. There are lines that we will stand tough on. We will not allow Russia to take over another country, take over a NATO country, take over the Ukraine. We will not allow them just to apply force in the Middle East without any kind of limits. And we will clearly not allow him to conduct cyber operations in this country. We have got to draw those lines. And if we don't, and he continues to sense weakness on the part of the United States, Putin will continue to be a serious threat to this country.
President Trump recently referred to himself as a nationalist, and that's a word that has a long history and a lot of different meanings. But over the weekend in France, there was some indication of continuing fissures or fractures among our allies, among our NATO allies. Do you see any of the nationalist, populist movements that are being fanned across Europe as benign or as threatening in any particular way? Are they reflections of particular threats to our collective security and even to the kind of liberal democratic values that the United States has played such a big role in advancing and protecting over the last 70 years?
Is this for Leon?
For Secretary Panetta.
I'm concerned about, obviously, this kind of nationalistic trend that we see not only in our own country, but obviously in countries in Europe. And it's the result of a lot of factors. I think one of those factors, frankly, is just the lack of leadership to try to bring those countries together in order to deal with the challenges that are there. Immigration and refugee flows have added to the problem. At the same time, there are economic issues that have added to the problem. All of these things have contributed to this kind of growing nationalistic reaction. And it's dangerous because we went through this in the 30s. We saw what happened with Germany. We saw what happened with fascist Italy and Japan. And we saw ultimately what we had to do in the devastation of World War II in order to take on those forces, those kinds of nationalistic forces that were there at the time. Now, I know that Trump uses the word, and he's proud of using the word. And the fact is, look, all of us believe that we do have to protect America, that we care about America first, but at the same time, you don't want to use terms that convey the idea that somehow we don't have to respect others, that we don't have to pay attention to the problems that other human beings are having. We do have basic values that democracy has been all about. And it means that we pay attention to the problems facing people, and we worry about freedom, and we worry about liberty, and we worry about whether or not there is mutual respect for one another, regardless of their race or their color or their creed. And the sense now is that this term can be used and that it incites those who basically are against those very values. So I think it's much more important for this country to try to assert world leadership than to pretend that somehow we can be nationalistic and not have to care about the others. I think President Macron was right. The reality is that those who use nationalism are basically flying in the face of the fundamental alliances that have to be built in order to protect our world. And that's the path we need to take in the future. It isn't one where we just hide from the rest of the world and think that somehow we can just take care of our own problems. We have got to work with the rest of the world in order to solve the challenges that we're facing in a very dangerous world.
Vice President Cheney, you want to comment on that?
No, I agree with much of what Leon said. But part of the problem is you cannot organize the kind of effort that succeeded in defeating the Russians in the Cold War. I mean, it's not that long ago, January of '91, as I recall, the Soviet Union went out of business, just ended. A lot of the member states became sovereign, free, and independent states. And a lot of that came about because of the work of the United States leading the free world in the efforts so that it became clear to the Soviets that they could not match what we were doing in terms of our capabilities, in terms of our technologies and so forth. But it will not happen if the United States doesn't make it happen. There isn't any other nation in the world that can take on the kind of leadership role we have and succeed. And otherwise, we'll get fragmentation of various coalitions out there. NATO is one of the great success stories in the history of diplomacy. It costs money, but those funds, U.S. troops deployed over there, all of that ultimately provided victory and guaranteed that the Russians couldn't go forward with what they would have liked to have done, and that was to take an even larger part of Europe. So the responsibility is ours as a nation if we're going to keep things on the level they need to be on as we claim victory in the Cold War. I worry now, and I think Leon's articulated it very well, as long as we get into the posture where it's every man for himself, where we're not interested in alliances, we're not willing to deploy troops or work with other countries, then we will not be able to take on the kind of responsibilities that's been so important to our survival for the last 75 years.
Let me throw a little bit of a change up in here. Vice President Cheney, you represent an oil, gas, and coal state, an energy extraction state. In fact, I interviewed for a job in Casper, and the price of a drink at the hotel bar was 10% of the closing price of a barrel of oil that day. So some sensitivity to the Secretary Panetta, you're stranded in California. I understand partly because of some difficulties associated with the fires ravaging California. And I wonder to what extent, if we're talking about national security threats, I know the Department of Defense addressed potential national security threats posed by global climate change. Secretary Panetta, do you want to make a couple short responses to whether you see any threats associated with that? And I'll let Vice President Cheney take a short chance to answer.
Yeah, no, I think there has to be a recognition of reality, and the reality is that that climate change is real, and that we need to confront that. And I viewed the impact of climate change, along with the military establishment at the Pentagon, as something we needed to pay attention to. In terms of its impact on security, because if there were increasing droughts, if there were increasing refugee flows that resulted from that, if there are rising seas that are going to impact on our installations or on coastline bases or on coastlines generally to force populations to move, all of that represents the potential for security threats. And so I thought it was important to be able to have an area there that would review what the threats were as a result of these changes taking place, in order that we could build it into our intelligence position and into our planning for the future, so that we could deal with potential threats if they happen.
It's pretty hard to argue with the notion that climate change is a real problem, especially when you look at the tragedy that's currently proceeding, even as we meet in California. And the question, obviously, I think is increasingly, we're getting to the point where everybody has to admit there is climate change. There's still a debate over how it's caused, and that's not surprising. But it's going to be a major challenge of our time, and for this generation and future generations.
I know we're running short on time. I see that a couple people have asked Vice President Cheney about his opinion on the upcoming movie Vice starring Christian Bale as Dick Cheney. I'll hold off on that question for a minute.
Come on, Leon, they'll do it to you someday.
Both
It's going to be the Italian version.
are strong people with strong personalities and strong views, passionate about your positions, and you've both worked for a boss, a president. And so there are some people interested in, given the personalities and the passion that you have, how's your relationship with your former bosses?
Well, I think pretty good. We didn't always agree on everything. With respect to the movie, it's Hollywood trying to make a buck. I haven't seen it. I had nothing to do with it. My wife is, she's intrigued because Amy Adams has been asked to play her, and she thinks that's all right. But no, it's Hollywood. I haven't seen it. I have seen the trailer. My 18-year-old granddaughter, who just went off to college at the University of Wyoming, she saw it before anybody else did, and she called up. And she said, Grandpa, I saw the trailer on your movie. And I said, well, what did you think? She said, well, it says you were a real badass, and that's cool.
Listen, I've had somewhat the same experience when the movie Zero Dark 30 came out that did the story of the Bin Laden raid. I can remember Gandolfini, who played me in the movie, wrote me a card and said, I know you probably don't like the way I played you, but you're Italian, I'm Italian, I have great respect for you. And I called him up because I had met him several times, and I said, no, look, it's Hollywood, it's a movie. I'm just glad they picked an Italian to play me. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, he said, one of the things they made me do in the movie was to use a lot of four-letter words. And I said, well, that's the one thing you got right.
Final question. We're on a tight clock here. What course of action would both of you recommend to today's members of Congress, as well as the president, in order to come back to bipartisanship work between both parties? Vice President Cheney.
Well, if it were easy to solve, it would have been solved. My interest in Congress it really focuses on my daughter. I'm fascinated by watching her operate, and obviously very proud. And also, it's intriguing that both Leon and I have our offspring following in our own seats. Maybe they'll be able to do more. I would hope so. But it is a difficult task. A lot of it turns on leadership and the kind of tone and tenor that are set by the leaders of the parties and by the president. And I think those are the places where we're likely to see progress, if there's going to be progress.
Secretary Panetta?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Dick just said. A lot of it depends on the leadership of the president and the leadership in Congress and the willingness to really try to sit down and work through these very tough issues. This is a difficult time. There's no question about it. And Dick and I see it through his daughter and my son in Congress. Jimmy, my youngest son, he came back to Washington during the time that I said when Republicans and Democrats got together, and You know, we would go out to dinner together. We would go on trips together. We had played basketball together. We did a number of things working together. He saw that relationship. He's frustrated by what he sees today because he's a veteran from the Afghan war. And like other veterans who have been elected, they don't want to just go back to Washington and pound their shoe on the table. They want to get things done. So the one source of hope for me is that he and a group of others have created this problem solvers caucus. I think 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans, who are trying to sit down and work through issues like healthcare and immigration, et cetera, to try to come up with bipartisan solutions. I think that's where the hope is for the future. It's not going to change from the top down. I wish it could, but I don't think that's going to happen. It's going to change when newer members get elected who want to govern and who insist on governing and are willing to vote against their own leadership in order to govern. When that happens, things can change.
All right, well, we're out of time tonight. I want to give a hand and a big thank you to Vice President Cheney, who came here tonight, to Secretary Panetta, who stayed with us and stuck it out to be able to show up here tonight. I want to thank again the Murtha Foundation, Ed Sheehan and Mike Kane at the Community Foundation, Mrs. Murtha, Dr. Spector for helping bring this event together. Thank you all for coming out. I understand it's turned to snow now outside. It is November in Johnstown. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.